will start the first panel. If you are interested more on the bios of our panelists, you can find the bios outside. And the first panel is China and the global strategic landscape. And it's my pleasure to invite Chen Yunnan of ODI to speak about the Belt and Road Initiative in the Global South. I admit I don't know what the Global South means, but maybe you'll start with that. Please.
Hi everyone, and it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you so much to Josh, Tuvia, and the whole team at Notre and JISS for hosting this fantastic event. I have the unenviable task of sort of kicking off and setting the scene for the rest of today. And perhaps, I mean, to start with and answering the question of what is the Global South, I don't have a good answer to this, frankly. The Global South is now what we use to refer to perhaps formerly what we would call developing countries or the Third World. But on the whole, this is something that encompasses the rest of the world that is not the advanced industrialized countries. China considers itself a Global South country, and this is, I think, key. And China considers itself a leader to the Global South. On the Belt and Road Initiative in the Global South, the Belt and Road Initiative may have started as a way to connect China and Western Europe to begin as a Eurasian project, but it has really become a Global South project. So I'll just start with that comment. But in my remarks today, I want to structure it around four things. The first, perhaps most importantly, is what is the Belt and Road Initiative? Second is why and how the Belt and Road Initiative really emerged. Third, I will then discuss a little bit on what I see as the impacts or key impacts for the Global South, as we call it. And then fourth, maybe to just kick off some discussion on where we think it's going. So firstly, on what is the Belt and Road Initiative. And just to preface this, that I don't perhaps share the background of many of you in that I come from a development studies background. My background is looking at Chinese development finance. So a lot of what I say will be colored by that perspective. So what do we know about the Belt and Road Initiative? Well, this is something that's been a changing and a slippery concept over the last decade or so. In 2013, it was first announced by Xi Jinping on an official visit to Kazakhstan as the Silk Road Economic Belt. And really, it began as an extension of China's Go West strategy. This was a legacy initiative from the mid-2000s, which sought to promote or to perhaps impose development via connectivity, via infrastructure, via trade in China's poorer hinterland regions, in its real western regions, and to bring it up to catch up to the booming coastal east. And this was to create, let's say, a good neighborhood for development in China's west. And so this really started as something that was a Eurasian project, as I said, to connect China's west in Xinjiang, in Yunnan, Tibet, to China's western neighbors. Since then, it has evolved. We've seen the addition of a 21st century maritime Silk Road, which extended into Southeast Asia, expanding to East Africa. It became One Belt, One Road, or Ilan, and it still remains that name in Chinese, but in its outward-facing vision, in its English name, it has become the Belt and Road Initiative, and it has become the defining framework for China's overseas engagement and for China's overseas engagement with Global South countries. The Belt and Road Initiative has become embedded into pretty much every aspect of China's discursive relations with developing countries. It has become part of the FOCAC arrangements, in China's relations with Africa. And underpinning all of this, underpinning the Belt and Road Initiative, I think is really this philosophy of, or an idea that China is promoting, of development through connectivity. And this draws from China's own domestic development experience. So the Belt and Road Initiative for the last decade has been defined by a program of massive infrastructure investment. We've seen this in the development of port networks, roads, significant and costly railway infrastructure investment, but also in other aspects of connectivity, in digital infrastructure, in people-to-people exchanges and cultural exchanges, and also in the expansion of China's private sector outwards. Development in this way is seen as a means to promote security and stability as well. By promoting development in China's own neighborhood, in its near abroad and far abroad, there is also a wider enlightened self-interest, let's say, for China's own economic development. China's own economic rise has been dependent on a functioning, stable and prosperous global system and a global economy. And the Belt and Road Initiative is seen as a key part of that. Some key facts. Thus far, the total investment in terms of construction contracts and FDI are estimated to total around $580 billion thus far, according to researchers at the Green Finance and Development Center in Ilan. The Belt and Road Initiative has been supported by a raft of official lending from China's policy banks. This has been estimated at around $500 billion US, around 462 billion between 2008 and 2019, according to estimates from Boston University. And this basically hips the World Bank in terms of total lending. So really the Belt and Road Initiative and this era of the Belt and Road Initiative is defined by this crescence, this rise of China as a creditor to the global South. So what are the drivers behind the emergence of the Belt and Road? I think there are, let's say, three key purposes in the Belt and Road Initiative. The first is strategic. It's a way to build geopolitical influence in building economic corridors for trade that support diverse trade routes for China's energy security. The BRI can be seen as a grand strategy and has become an instrument of its bilateral diplomatic engagement alongside the Forum of China-Africa Cooperation and other regional initiatives. But I think it's also important to emphasize that this is a bottom-up process as well as a top-down policy signal. The Belt and Road Initiative is not a designed plan coming from the pen of Xi Jinping. It is also something that has been co-constituted by Chinese contractors, by private investors, by entrepreneurs on the ground, often pulling the state behind them rather than being directed by the state. The political side of the Belt and Road Initiative. There's an international facing rationale of China as well as a rising power. The Belt and Road Initiative has become a defining piece of PR, we could say, that China is trying to use to shape itself or to define itself as a provider of global public goods, to present itself as open to global markets and as an instrument for bilateral diplomacy with global South countries. But this is more of a hub and spoke system than true multilateralism, but it's a way to bolster China's image, right, as a leader of the global South, as a provider of key infrastructure investments at a time when that has been scarce. It's also become synonymous with Xi's personal brand, and really you can't emphasize enough how much it is tied to his personal direction and his legacy. It's become embedded in China's own constitution, and in many ways it has been more of a policy signal and an ad hoc policy label to to affix to what has been already happening over the last 20 years. We've seen the Belt and Road Initiative now followed up by new announcements of the Global Development Initiative and the Global Security Initiative. There's a lot of questions being raised about what these are, what they contain. And it's interesting to consider, the Belt and Road Initiative when it started was similarly nebulous. It was something that was created as it went along. But this is the point that's been a strength of the BRI. It's an instrument of spin rather than a grand design. And it also allows for adaptability and flexibility. That means that it can continue through different focuses, through different sectors and perspectives as it evolves. In terms of its impacts for the Global South, China's Belt and Road Initiative, I think I can say, has not been a bad thing. The pros, we have seen a massive going out of Chinese capital and Chinese contractors, which has enabled massive infrastructure investment at a time when most traditional creditors, donors and financiers have not been willing or able to finance it. The Belt and Road Initiative really peaked in the early 2010s, where after the global financial crisis, the World Bank, most European donors, most private sector creditors from the global north had been severely hit economically, were not willing to invest in the risky markets or perceived risky markets of Africa, of the Global South. Enter China. China's Belt and Road Initiative offers alternatives for Global South countries, and it gave them the capacity and the space to set their own development agendas by leveraging Chinese investment and Chinese interest to pursue their own industrialization strategies. This has been very marked in countries such as Rwanda and Ethiopia that have really wholesale adopted the East Asian development model and borrowed a lot from the East Asian and Chinese development experience. And corresponding to that, massive infrastructure investment through using Chinese capital, Chinese technologies, and Chinese firms. Having those alternative sources of finance also gave Global South leaders a good amount of policy space, and this has been the other advantage. When you have alternatives on the table, it increases your bargaining power. So having China as a bargaining chip has been a useful political tool for Global South countries, where over the last 30 years, basically since the end of the Cold War, there has only been one set of donors, that of the Washington Consensus, that of policy conditionality, whereas Chinese finance, Chinese loans, Chinese aid do not impose the same kinds of political conditionalities. Not all of this is gone to plan, and of course I have to talk about the cons as well. This rise of the Belt and Road Initiative has also caused huge debt overhangs in many countries. The economic driver behind the Belt and Road Initiative has really primarily been domestic, right? It was a spatial fix for China's own domestic economic woes, particularly after 2008. The huge domestic economic stimulus that the Chinese government instituted after the global financial crisis led to significant overinvestment and overcapacity, especially in steel and key sectors, which pushed out Chinese firms, which pushed out Chinese capital, and pushed out Chinese policy banks to fund a lot of these projects. So for China, it's been a way to export its excess capacity and to promote its key strategic sectors. But a lot of that, let's say, has not necessarily paid off. A lot of these projects have been overambitious. We've seen significant controversy around key Belt and Road Initiative projects, for example, in the railway sector across East Africa. So the Belt and Road Initiative, I think, at least in its early period, really exemplifies a period of over-exuberance, perhaps, in China's going out machine. Right? You have banks mandated to support domestic industries, to support domestic exports. You have Chinese contractors that are seeking commercial returns, seeking new markets and new commercial opportunities with the implicit backing of the Chinese state. And you have, on the other demand side, governments with huge infrastructure wish lists without, let's say, specific due diligence or sufficient consideration of the risks of some of these projects, because you want to get elected and the political cycle is short. The consequences we've seen in the last half-decade has been really an emerging debt crisis in the global south, and I think this has been one of the significant legacies of the Belt and Road Initiative. Debt service and debt restructuring is going to be a key area of tension and an issue for the global south in their relations with China in the years to come. We've seen in the post-COVID era already China move to joining multilateral debt initiatives, given the very systemic impact of COVID on a lot of these countries that have participated in the Belt and Road Initiative. And so this is already problematic, and we don't even need to call it debt trap diplomacy, which has been a rising hyperbole in describing China's lending overseas. But a lot of this I don't see as necessarily predatory. Perhaps it's a result of lack of oversight, certainly. Lack of due diligence, certainly. Misaligned incentives, certainly. The other cons of the BRI that we're going to see in the years to come is that there are also huge risks in accepting Chinese companies, Chinese technologies, and Chinese finance. One is that the Belt and Road Initiative, given its own motivation, its own driver to export Chinese firms and Chinese goods, means that Chinese companies have a strong incentive to keep a monopoly in key strategic sectors. So for global south countries that build a Chinese railway or bring in Chinese digital companies, there is a risk of overdependence on these Chinese technologies, on Chinese standards, in key strategic infrastructures where perhaps domestic capacity is not sufficient to ensure autonomy. And using these Chinese goods and technologies also builds path-dependent effects, right? It's a way to embed a comparative advantage for Chinese firms in the years to come. There's also evidence that Chinese projects do contribute to governance issues and facilitates issues around local corruption. And that is in part because Chinese banks do not have the capacity or the current frameworks to enact due diligence like finances such as the World Bank. To conclude, whether the Belt and Road Initiative going forward. So even prior to COVID, lending has been slowing down for a number of years. Since 2015, and particularly after 2017, we've seen a shift in China's domestic financial landscape. Policy banks and commercial banks have been facing greater scrutiny and tightening banking regulations. So I think it's very important to emphasize that the Belt and Road Initiative has been and will be continued to be shaped by China's domestic internal conditions. As China's economy boomed and grew, as did its overseas ambitions, now China is also facing increasing domestic headwinds in ensuring a post-COVID recovery, which becomes increasingly tenuous given the impact of COVID lockdowns And this will also determine the shape of the Belt and Road Initiative to come. COVID has also stalled many projects and halted the plans of many others. And it's also, in the years to come, going to impact the ability of governments in the Global South to really borrow significantly from China and from elsewhere. There's also increased controversy and over the optics of lending. We've all heard the term around debt traps. Whilst I would argue that there is insufficient evidence to say that China is engaging in debt trap diplomacy, this debt overhang, as I mentioned, has been a real negative effect, let's say, of the Belt and Road Initiative, and will hamper the growth trajectories of many Global South countries to come, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa, who have, many of whom have been some of the key applicants to the multilateral debt initiatives in the DSSI. So I think we're going to see a shift, and we're already seeing a shift in the Belt and Road Initiative to more small but beautiful projects. So less of the big ticket infrastructure, more smaller infrastructure projects, a shift from connectivity as transport to connectivity in the digital space. So it's down but not out. I think we're also seeing an increasing degree of discipline as well in the Belt and Road Initiative. You know, we have to remember that this is still an evolving project. It has never been defined and is still yet to be defined. As the Belt and Road Initiative grows, green finance and green considerations are also going to become a growing factor in increasing the number of renewable projects, increasing in finance into climate-friendly and green projects. And to conclude, well, I'll conclude there. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Chen. I'd like to invite Ilan Berman of the American Foreign Policy Council to speak about China's balancing act between Iran and the Gulf.
Well, thank you very much. So first of all, let me start by thanking Daniel and Jonathan and Gabi at Notre Dame and Tantur, thanking Efraim and Tuvia at JISS, and also thanking my colleague Joshua Eisenman, because in addition to his role at the University of Notre Dame, he is also the Senior Fellow for China Studies at my institute, at the American Foreign Policy Council. So I've been benefiting from his wisdom on China and sort of how China is evolving, is changing, is sort of reshaping the global order for quite a few years now. So it's always nice to play in this sandbox, especially because it is finally a topic that abuts the things that I research, which is the Middle East, geopolitical trends in the MENA region. So this is really, I think, fantastic. In Washington, the topic that people speak about is never what is written on the paper. So let me do a Washington thing and shift slightly, because I think what's necessary in order to set the table is to understand from Washington, where our office is on Capitol Hill, how the region is seen, how things are changing, and how China's entry into the region is being perceived, at least by a slice of policymakers in the United States. So I just want to hit on a few. I want to stay at 60,000 feet. I want to hit on a few sort of big ticket macro items as a way of setting a table for what I hope is a very rich discussion. The first is that U.S. Middle East policy towards the greater Middle East is in the process of redefinition. And it's something that's been happening for a number of years now, but there's this great debate that's underway in the United States about the extent to which the U.S. can and should be involved in the Middle East, or whether it should turn its attention to other items. And this is driven by a number of factors. This is driven, for example, by the decline of the Middle East as an energy source in importance for the United States. you saw a very steep incline in the Middle East's importance in the Cold War era, in the immediate aftermath of the Cold War era, as U.S. consumption increased. But over the last decade, you've seen what has colloquially come to be known as the U.S. energy revolution, which has fundamentally altered patterns of consumption in the United States. Now, there's nothing that's constant except death and taxes. So you're beginning to see this shifting a little bit. Part of it is political priorities in Washington. Part of it is the external shocks that are created by geopolitical events like the Russian invasion of Ukraine. But my sense is that the larger trajectory of U.S. energy consumption, U.S. energy policy is pretty much the same. It's pretty much on this process of disengagement from the Middle East, irrespective of what President Biden and the Saudi Crown Prince talk about in a couple of weeks when the president's in the region. I think the larger trend line is pretty clear, and it's one that in which the Middle East is diminishing in importance in this context. The second trend line is that you're seeing a fundamental change in the nature of U.S. counterterrorism policy. We are 21 years after the events of September 11th, so you've had a generational change. I have a son who's a freshman in college. He was not alive during the events of September 11th. There's no reference frame for many of the people who are now part of the American young voter electorate, young voter cohort, in which there would be something that we experienced a generation ago, which is broad bipartisan support for a forward stance on what was then known as the global war on terror. There's increasing appetite to end what have come to be known as forever wars, which is why the Afghan withdrawal, which everybody in Washington, everybody here watched, and there's lots of things to say about it, there's lots of things to criticize, but the reality is that this was a priority of the Trump administration before it was a priority of the Biden administration, because all politics are local, and the American electorate is souring on this overseas engagement, overseas contingency operation mindset. And so you're seeing this declining appetite. And when you layer on top of that the political turmoil that we've seen domestically in the United States since the election of 2020, there is, I would argue, diminishing appetite for the type of broad counterterrorism policy that you saw in the region before. But I think, for my money, the most significant strategic development has been a shift in American focus. And I think it's exactly correct to call it a pivot, right? Because in the English language, a pivot connotes a turn away from something and a turn towards something. And in the United States, you have seen, since President Obama's November 2011 speech before the Australian Parliament, a very clear shift in American priorities, economic and geopolitical priorities, away from the Middle East and towards the Asia Pacific as a theater for political activity, theater for economic life. Now, you can't ignore the politics of the day. So it bears noting that President Obama made this decision, made this pivot, made this shift, while the Middle East was being convulsed by the multiple revolutions of the Arab Spring, to which, charitably, the United States didn't have a very good answer to. The United States didn't really know how to navigate that field. So it was, in many ways, easier to shift attention away from an enormously problematic region towards a region that, at least at that time, held enormous economic promise, enormous growth opportunity, and, if you pardon the pun, more Pacific waters for the U.S. to navigate. So that's the first point, right? The U.S. policy in the Middle East is in this process. The American ship of state moves slowly, but it is in this process of reorientation. The second point is that there is a redefinition, increasingly, of U.S. approach towards China, right? So for almost a generation, we in the United States have embraced this idea of China as a responsible stakeholder, or the aspiration to create responsible stakeholdership in China. The basic premise, which has proven to be sadly inaccurate, is that the more China is involved in multilateral institutions, the more we can sort of incorporate them, ingratiate them into the Western-led international legal order, the Western-led international economic order, the more we can moderate some of the more destructive impulses of the Chinese government. And this has proven increasingly inaccurate as a frame to understand Chinese behavior over the last several years. And long before the Americans started understanding this, but over the last several years, there really has been a redefinition of American policy towards China, where the responsible stakeholder frame has fallen away. We've moved towards, under the Trump administration, towards this idea of great power competition between the United States and China. Now we have a more nuanced view of managed competition, responsible competition under the Biden administration. We can talk about what all those nuances are, but the really interesting thing is that this competition now extends across multiple domains. It's technological, it's economic, but it really hasn't broadened to embrace the Middle East, right? And so this is where the nexus of the two things come in. America is turning away, and China is turning its attention to the Middle East. And this is where I think there's a lot of scholarship that has been done, but there's a lot more scholarship that needs to be done, because there is, at least in Washington, a very rudimentary impressionistic sense of what China wants in the region, what China's trying to do in the region, how Chinese geopolitical objectives marry up with the Belt and Road, marry up with the economic construct, how the Middle East and North Africa really further Chinese objectives. And so there is, for those of us that have spent time on this, have focused on this, there is a dawning understanding that China is trying to build what my colleague Mike Duran has called a Middle East kingdom, right? China is trying to build, this is not just impressionistic Chinese engagement with different countries, this is a strategy, right? It may be a little bit too much to call it a grand strategy, but it's certainly a vision of how China wants to move around the region. And this is a vision that is unlike what most people understand. It's not just about economic engagement with the Sunni Arab states. It's not just Chinese billions of dollars of Chinese investment in Saudi Arabia or the Emirates, Kuwait, or what have you. It is a very balanced vision in which Iran has identified the three legs of the stool geopolitically that exists in the Middle East. There's the Sunni leg, there's the Shiite leg, and then there's this one. And the Chinese are advancing their objectives along all three fronts. On the Sunni side, you see it's mostly geoeconomic. It's mostly these massive investments. When it was tallied by a policy institute in Washington 2 years ago, at that time, just in terms of Belt and Road Initiative related investments, China was estimated to have sunk more than $123 billion in the Middle East and North Africa, which the U.S. thinks about as a unit. That total is much larger now, just on the Belt and Road, and that total is even larger when you start talking about non-Belt and Road related initiatives. So China is here, China is moving around the region in very robust terms economically, and China's clout politically and persuasively is growing as America disengages, because there is a sense on the part of many countries in the Gulf that I visited that as America retracts over the horizon, they need a more stable, more immediate partner. And you see this in Saudi Arabia, you see this in the Emirates, you see this in Efraim. And so there is this jockeying that's going on. On the Shiite side of the fence, Iran and China signed a 25-year strategic accord, right? As they call it, a comprehensive strategic partnership, evaluated if it comes to pass, right? And that's an important caveat because it hasn't come to pass. But if it comes to pass, it's evaluated at $400 billion. But I don't think it's going to come to pass. Right? Eric is shaking his head. It's not going to come to pass. But I actually think that this is an important pact to understand in geostrategic terms, because timing is everything. The Iranians concluded this pact, which involves a very significant rollback of their national sovereignty at precisely the time when the Trump administration was applying maximum pressure. The Iranian economy and their revenue from oil sales was being curtailed very significantly. And the concessions that the Iranians agreed to, including the potential for the IRGC-N, the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Navy, and the People's Liberation Army Navy, to do joint maneuvers in the Sea of Oman, to base out of the port of Chabahar. All of this stuff is on the table. And it's on the table, you must understand, from an Iranian context in which at that time there was a beleaguered regime in Tehran that was willing to give away a portion of its autonomy to China in exchange for extended viability. Now, it's interesting, right? Geopolitics is a fickle thing because things are changing. And so Iran, economically, because of a rollback of American maximum pressure policy, is in much more stable economic footing. And as a result, the need for thoroughgoing Chinese penetration has diminished, at least somewhat, in Iran, at least for the moment. But politics are variable, things may change. So it's necessary to point out that, at least strategically, the Chinese have planted a major flag in the southeast of Iran, right? In a port, they've planted a major flag in the Iranian telecom sector, etc. And then there's the Israeli legacy. And I know all of you who are here understand this very well, you probably understand this much better than I, but as seen from Washington, the level of Chinese involvement and investment in Israel, the degree to which Israel threw its doors open and said, we are the startup nation, as that wonderful book by Saul Singer and Dan Snore is called, has been embraced by the national leadership and has invited in foreign participants, has created an opening that the Chinese government has exploited. And it's exploited to become the single largest nation-state investor in Israel's high-tech sector as of right now. And this is significant because there's all sorts of associated technological risks that come along with this sort of involvement. But it's also significant because it rubs up against and it's in tension with the special relationship that Israel has with the United States. And increasingly, in the last administration, you saw administration officials talking about the fact that the length and depth and breadth of the special relationship between Washington and Jerusalem may be adversely affected by the degree of Chinese penetration into technologies that are effectively dual use, artificial intelligence, surveillance, things like that. And as a result, there is this ebb and flow in conversations between the two capitals. Under the Trump administration, the Israeli government took a very significant step in response to American demands of setting up something resembling an analog to CFIUS, to the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States, which we have, which is an interagency body that monitors nation-state investment that may be strategic in the U.S. economy. But it's not a near peer, it's not an analog. There's a multi-billion-dollar carve-out for Israeli tech because the high-tech sector is the fastest moving sector of the Israeli economy. And as a result, what you're seeing, to the surprise of at least some people in Jerusalem and at the Keough, right? You're seeing very significant continuity in American concerns between the Trump administration and the Biden administration about how Israel is unwittingly becoming vulnerable or at least potentially compromised by its level of involvement with China. And this is, my sense is, this is a big conversation. This is increasingly a big conversation as U.S. and Israeli strategic interests diverge over things like Iran, over things like energy policy. This is going to become a very significant irritant potentially in the relationship. So where does that leave us, right? What you have is three takeaways, basically. First of all, through the pattern in which, I'll do that well before Trump, through the pattern of the way in which China has made its investment, both on the Sunni side and on the Shiite side and on the Jewish side, on the Israeli side, it is very clear that Beijing views these investments in geopolitical terms. Right? We've heard a lot about the Belt and Road as a geoeconomic construct, and about there's obviously that component. But in the context of realigning the Middle East into an environment that is more conducive to Chinese strategic priorities, it's very clear that Beijing is applying this through a geopolitical frame as a means to displace the United States as the partner of choice for at least some countries in the region. Right? This is as we Americans call it, this is a Hail Mary pass. This is something that the Chinese are doing. Small chance of success, but you are already beginning to see the reorientation in some parts, certainly of the African continent, with regard to how they think about the United States. And so you have to understand that these investments are, at the very least, dual use. But more and more, as you move from sub-Saharan Africa to North Africa to the Levant to the Gulf, these are seen increasingly in geostrategic terms. The second is that China has very adroitly used its investments on both the Sunni side and the Shiite side of the Muslim world to squelch Muslim criticism of what it's doing at home with regard to its Uyghur Muslim minority. And you're beginning, the silence, right, as seen from Washington, the silence is deafening. And it creates a policy dilemma, not only for the United States, but it creates a policy dilemma for Israel as well. Because more than any other country, Israel knows what it means to say never again. But Israel can't be more Muslim than the Muslim world. And so when you don't see criticism of Chinese repressive practices, which multiple American administrations, Republican and Democrat, have confirmed is a genocide, you have a real dilemma. What the Chinese are learning is a very dangerous lesson. The lesson is that you can silence through investments. And this is something that I think is not a moderating influence on Chinese thinking, and it's something that you're likely to see accelerate over time as the Chinese economy cools, as there's increasing international scrutiny over the Xinjiang genocide, right? This is something that they're going to wield as a geopolitical system. And the third priority, and I'm trying to tee up David's presentation because I know he's going to talk at least a little bit about tech, is the degree to which the Belt and Road has become a conveyor for repressive Chinese technology, right? And I think this is hugely significant because China has built a very robust self-censorship mechanism animated by high technology, animated by artificial intelligence, by facial recognition. For those of you that have read it, there's this fantastic expose in the New York Times about the scope and breadth of the Chinese surveillance state. This is a real thing, and increasingly we're seeing these technologies migrate along the Belt and Road to at least somewhat receptive governments in the Middle East and North Africa, and deeper into Africa. And so from an American perspective, this is enormously worrisome because over time, if this is successful, if companies like ZTE and Huawei do penetrate very significantly in other places the way they have in Lebanon, the way they have in Egypt, the way they've managed to shape censorship in the Islamic Republic of Iran, for example, you see a region that becomes less free, less open, and less receptive to liberal democracy. And this is a region where the US is going to have more trouble moving around half a decade from now than we do currently. So I'm going to stop there. Hopefully that sparked a bit of thought, and I am under my time.
I'm not sure the Chinese are to be blamed for lack of democracy in our region. We'll see about it. Is a Q&A period. I would like to invite to talk Dr. David O. Shullman from the Atlantic Council on China, authoritarianism, and MENA. MENA, for some who that don't know, it's Middle East and North Africa.
Well, thank you for the introduction and for that question about to what extent is China responsible for authoritarianism in the Middle East, and I'll kind of get into that a little bit in this presentation, and I will, unlike Ilan, kind of stick to what I was told to do because I'm that kind of person, despite the mores of Washington. So I want to thank JSS and Notre Dame for having me and for putting on this great conference. I want to thank my friend Dr. Joshua Eisenman for having me, who's a partner with me in what we're doing between Notre Dame and the Atlantic Council on looking at China and the Global South. And this subject matter of the role of China in exporting or promoting authoritarianism, and especially what that means for a region like the Middle East, where, as we know, there are already many regimes that are non-democratic, I think is at the heart of some of these questions around the role of China in the developing world in the Global South, and what that means going forward. So what I want to do in my brief remarks here is to kind of touch on that broader question of China's promotion of authoritarianism, and then relate it directly to questions around the Middle East, and then come back around at the end a little bit to throw out some questions about what this means for U.S. policy, which perhaps we can get into in more depth in the discussion. So first, I think it's important to lay out what China's promotion or support for authoritarianism globally is not, right? It's not an evangelical mission to create little mini Chinese communist parties all around the world. It's not a desire to set up a new Comintern. China and Chinese leaders believe that the Marxist-Leninist system that they have, or they believe that they have inside China, is specific to the conditions of China's system, and Chinese socialism and Chinese mode of development, right? I think it's really important to underline that China's not going around and trying to undermine democracies around the world. You don't see Chinese leaders in Zhongnanhai and the leadership compound kind of plotting the next overthrow of a democracy in places around the world. That all said, I think there is definitely a case to be made for the fact that China, by dint of the way it's engaging around the world, its rhetoric, and its actions at the international and country level, is having an effect where it's undermining democratic principles and institutions around the world to the detriment of individual rights and freedoms. So how has this happened? So I think first, at the kind of broad level, we do see from the Chinese leadership, from officials throughout the system, a much more willing approach now to advocating for China's authoritarian system of governance, and for making the case essentially that, for many decades we've assumed that democracy is the best and perhaps only way of achieving development and achieving prosperity, and China says, look at us, look at what we've achieved, we're now the second biggest economy in the world, and we did that through our own way. We didn't take lecturing from the United States and from the developed democracies. You do not necessarily have to democratize to achieve our level of prosperity. And that, I think, in and of itself is a very important fact to underscore. We also see this happening at the international level in terms of what's happening in international institutions. China is playing a much more active role at the United Nations in particular. There's some scholarship out there that says, well, if we look at what China's doing in the UN, it actually doesn't have that much influence. They have limited role aside from what their position on the UN Security Council in shaping discussions and shaping the actions of the UN to benefit China's interests. I would say it's important to look at where China is placing its energies at the United Nations and international institutions, and look at where it's focused and how that is related to the core interests that China seeks to defend and advance and promote. And if you look at what China is doing in some of the specialized agencies of the United Nations, like the International Telecommunications Union, where it's shaping norms and standards around technology for the future. If you look at what's happening at the Human Rights Council, where China is playing a role in diminishing that body's already relatively weak ability to protect civil and political and individual rights around the world. And if you look at China's ability to shape discourse around issues that matter to it regarding development, around the Belt and Road Initiative, you see that China is having a significant amount of influence in the areas that matter to it and that have a direct relevance to the fate of democracy around the world and to individual rights and protections, and effectively to the role of liberal principles in the international order going forward. I don't want to get into this too deeply, it's kind of a subject for a much broader conversation, but when people discuss the question of to what extent does China want to revolutionize or revise the international order, I think one can agree that China wants to maintain many of the forms, many of the bodies, many of the institutions that continue to exist in the international order and from which it has benefited and how it has gotten to where it has in the world today. But it wants to effectively neuter the liberal aspects of that liberal international order, to remove the democratic principles and defense of individual rights, which has been at the heart, I would argue, of that order since its founding decades and decades ago. So that's at the international level. I think we also see, and people have been paying more attention to this, I think it merits it, the fact that we see China now trying to shape the narrative about what the very definition of democracy is, right? And we see China talking about its own whole process, democracy at home. We see China specifically now with Russia as a partner, going out and talking about the United States and the West, and I don't like the term the West, but developed democracies, claiming that they have ownership over what democracy means, and that is something that it's long overdue that kind of mentality needs to be shifted. This was a core element, and earlier was mentioned the joint statement that China and Russia put out in February before Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Central part of that document was about the need to revise the international order and the need to rebalance effectively developed democracy's ability to control the narrative about what democracy and about what rights means. And so that I think is a key thing to focus on. And this is happening in the human rights space as well, by the way. Xi Jinping just came out with an article in one of the party's flagship journals, Choshir, all about the definition of human rights and what we should think about that going forward. I think that's going to be a core element to China's push in the global south in the years ahead, and particularly through its new global development initiative, which perhaps we'll get into in the conversation. So that's happening at the international level, at some of the rhetorical level, and then at the country level, we see this happening as well. And again, I want to reiterate, not that China's going into individual countries through the Belt and Road Initiative or through any other means to undermine and overthrow legitimate democratic regimes. But through various means through which China is engaging, it is having this effect of degrading democratic institutions and supporting the liberal leaders around the world. This is happening through its investment and financing approach. I agree completely with Ms. Chen's analysis of the Belt and Road Initiative, what the drivers are, the pullback that we're seeing. But I think it's also important to underscore that despite the fact there's not necessarily a drive to debt trap countries, to seize their strategic assets, this kind of, I think, straw man argument that has been made now for a few years about, well, the Belt and Road Initiative is not about doing that, therefore we don't need to necessarily worry about what the Belt and Road Initiative means for democratic countries around the world. I think we need to look at the ways in which the actors that are involved in the Belt and Road Initiative, these are policy banks, these are state-owned enterprises, the way in which they engage in countries across the global south and in the Middle East too, although to a lesser extent, we'll get to that in a second, is to do so in a very opaque fashion, in a way that can undermine effectively political accountability, increases the chances for corruption in a lot of these countries where admittedly there are already significant corruption problems, and also creates the conditions for these problems in terms of debt and financial issues that have already been mentioned, because the terms of these deals are by nature usually not available to the public. They are secret, and there's not a lot of oversight of the kinds of terms of these deals that are being signed up to. At the same time, we have China playing a role in bolstering and keeping in power the liberal leaders who are already in power, right? This is through investment that, of course, unlike that from democracies, has no conditionality on it. It's untied to any progress in terms of democracy and human rights. This is investment that is frequently often timed to actually benefit China's political allies in countries. So, for instance, if you have an incumbent leader who is running to be reelected, who is trending in a more liberal direction and is a friend of China, investment might just happen to drop right before that election that benefits the political fortunes of that leader. So beyond that, I think it's also important to note that, and I won't spend too much time on this, there's also a shaping of the information space and the ability of independent media in a lot of these countries to have an oversight role in terms of keeping their own leaders honest and also in monitoring the role in which China's got in their economy and the way China is engaging with those leaders. And so in effect, China is helping to neuter a lot of these very institutions, independent media, civil society, and others, that are the ones that ought to be keeping their leaders honest and ought to be checking the negative effects that can come from economic engagement with China. Ilan already touched on some of the tech dynamics of what is happening in terms of China exporting surveillance technology, exporting the ability to monitor and control populations online and also the media and civil society. I won't get into that too much more except to say I think it really is true that this is the future of where we should be watching in terms of the effect that China's engagement with countries has on their on individual freedoms, on government's ability to monitor and control their own populations. And I think it's a fair and important point to make that China's not the only one that is exporting surveillance technology around the world. The United States does it. I think Israel does it. So that is important to acknowledge, and I think that there's more that needs to be done in the democratic world in terms of limiting those kinds of exports. But along with what China is exporting in the tech space, they're also bringing training. They're also bringing the investment. It's a full package that in many countries across the developing world has the effect of bolstering liberal trends and making it more likely that an authoritarian leader, or at least a non-democratic leader, is going to be able to stay in power longer. And I think it's important to really underscore how fragile democracies are, right? And we all know that, and we certainly know that in the United States, if we didn't know it already. In many countries, it's really doesn't take very much to tip the balance in the direction of a less democratic, more liberal direction. And this is especially true in the kind of world in which we live now, with the effects of the pandemic, with leaders looking for simple solutions to bolster economic growth and to answer the demands of their populace. And then, as a corollary of that, also protect themselves from the demands of their populace so that they can stay in power longer. And if you haven't read it, I highly recommend a book by Asimoglu and Robinson called The Narrow Corridor, which lays out this argument about this really tight, narrow space that exists for democracies to continue to thrive and for things not to tip into the direction of more strong authoritarian governance, which we've seen around the world now with the resurgence of authoritarianism. So you put all of this together, the promotion of China's model from the top, what's happening in international institutions in terms of China's kind of revising some of those liberal principles, and then what's happening at the country level. And I think you have some really significant effects in terms of bolstering authoritarianism around the world as a result of China's growing engagement. Now, what does all this mean for the Middle East in particular? I think Ilan did a good job kind of laying out some of China's interests and focus and why the Middle East is of interest to China, for energy reasons, for economic engagement reasons, to shift strategically the focus away from engagement with the United States and to have a role for China in the Middle East that is more protective of its growing global interests. But for the Chinese government, I think there's also significant recognition that the nature of the governments in much of the Middle East is a match made in heaven for China trying to increase its influence. Most obviously, China's message is welcome in much of the Middle East, right? That this least, I would argue, least democratic region in the world, and it's pushing on an open door in terms of its interest in deepening ties and at the U.S. expense. China's formula for development has an audience here, this notion of peace through development, which is at the core of how the Chinese government thinks of what it's doing at home and is also at the core of what it is pushing now internationally, as opposed to the democratic peace doctrine, that stability comes through development, through enhancing, by force if necessary, social cohesion, rather than importing supposedly Western notions of democratic values that China would argue values individual rights over stability and the prosperity that stability can unleash and the benefits that it can have for human security. In the Middle East, China tells like-minded leaders that with the U.S. pulling back and the U.S. doubling down on this dichotomy between democracy and authoritarianism, the U.S. is just going to lecture you, whereas we're going to invest, right? We are going to offer you the tools that can help you deliver development to your people, and if necessary, control them if they're threatening your long-term plans and particularly threatening your grip on power. And China is seen, as I mentioned earlier, as doing the hard work internationally to make that case that resonates in this region, that the West doesn't get to define rights and democracy anymore, that it's long overdue for that to shift. And I think this is true. Regardless of the nature of the regimes we're talking about, the non-democratic regimes we're talking about in the Middle East, whether they're nationalist Republican or monarchies or Islamist, despite these differences, I think they all see China's opening of a debate around democracy and human rights and Washington's tendency to deploy those things, as China would sell it, as a fig leaf to achieve political ends, or strategic ends, as long overdue. I think it's also important to note the issue of timing. The Arab Spring has already been mentioned. We've seen, of course, resurgent authoritarianism in the Middle East since the Arab Spring, and at the same time, we've had the incredible rise of China as a challenger for global leadership, really since 2010, 2011. And China's role as a non-democratic model has started to gel, I think, in the Middle East, arguably supercharging, and I think we can have a debate about this, maybe we can discuss it, supercharging already local moves towards hardened autocratic systems. So as we see in Egypt, for example, China's increasingly an important economic player. President al-Sisi has aggressively promoted a centralized development model that's based on the enhanced role of the state, economic-focused explanations of human rights, and the justification, of course, of draconian measures against dissent as necessary for national security. A lot of that sounds very similar to what China's saying. Now, does that mean that's what's driving what LCC is doing? No. But I think that there's a lot of similarities there that have really gelled in the last decade. And of course, and Ilan already mentioned this, in Egypt, as with a lot of the Gulf monarchies, one of the main pillars of cooperation with China is this notion of non-interference in each other's affairs, supporting each other's internal measures no matter the regime type or the regime's actions to safeguard stability. And this has most clearly and disturbingly been reflected in the Muslim states of the Middle East, unwillingness to come out against what's happening in Xinjiang, to come out against the genocide of Uyghur Muslims there. And I think the interest in it, I think it's partly Muslim-majority states not wanting to risk their relations with China and the effects of investment. I think it's also a shared opposition to any political expression of Islam in these governments, right? And I think that similarity is also something that we should pay attention to. Lastly on this, I think for China's success in the Middle East, in tackling problems and in developing through models that look more like its own, have the potential to pay dividends beyond the region. I think it's a good way to show the legitimacy of China's own non-democratic system, which is essential to clearing the path for China to become really at the center of global governance internationally. And in this most volatile of regions in the Middle East, one where the United States has tried and failed repeatedly to find solutions in lasting peace, to prove that development leads to peace and security, stability, and human progress over what they would see as obsession with democracy and individual rights, would be, I think, a major feather in validating China's own system and its pretensions to global leadership. So finally, I know I'm almost out of time, but I think all of this leads us to some fundamental questions about U.S. policy in the Middle East. It's already been mentioned that things don't seem to be headed exactly in the right direction necessarily there. And as we've heard, China's deepening ties in the region, the sense that the U.S. is disengaging or pivoting away, U.S. efforts to pressure countries on issues such as Huawei building their 5G infrastructure, having not been successful. It does not look like U.S. policy in the Middle East, vis-a-vis China in particular, is having a lot of success. So I think this leads us, at this moment when the Biden administration is focused on the democracy versus authoritarianism paradigm, so I think we need to legitimately ask the question, should Washington risk alienating this region further with an overtly ideological construct such as this that enables China to portray itself as the more reliable, supportive, like-minded partner, pushing countries potentially even more toward China? And then the even broader question of should we more broadly kind of abandon the effort to frame America's strategic competition with China and Russia as an ideological context? I don't have the answer. I think it's something we should discuss, but I will say I wouldn't go quite that far to say that that there should be no values-driven argument that's the core of U.S. foreign policy, particularly in this region. I think it continues to be a core element to not just citizens in these countries looking to the United States and looking to other developed democracies for hope at a moment when authoritarianism and repression is only growing. But I think it also, I'll very much align myself with those who say that to support our values and democracy aligns with our interests, right? And I think that continues to be true. And as I've demonstrated, this is not a one-sided conversation. The U.S. and our allies are not the only parties making this an ideological struggle, despite China's claims that we are the ones kind of starting a new Cold War and making this ideological. China is very much pushing its model, and we must make the argument for why democracy and universal human rights continue to matter. But I do think that perhaps toning down the rhetoric, making it less a black and white type of conversation, and as has been already mentioned, more engagement from the U.S. and from our allies in the region, more alternatives to offer these countries so that they're less dependent on China for their development needs, and to address them where they are, right, and to address the things that matter, not just to the regimes in the Middle East, but also to the people in the Middle East, I think is more the solution that we should be going towards. So I'll stop there and look forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, David. We have some time to probe our panelists, and we're opening for questions. Please.
So I have a question.
Introduce yourself.
Okay, my name is Eric Olander from the China Global South Project. I live in Vietnam, so I live in the Global South, in Southeast Asia. Wendy Sherman, the #2 diplomat of the United States, was just in town last week.
This is a recipe for disaster.
Well, and I want to address David and Ilan's point on American principles versus interests. Wendy Sherman came to Vietnam and spoke glowingly of the Vietnamese government. The Vietnamese government is an authoritarian, totalitarian government that has equally oppressive human rights as China does. She said the same thing in Laos, and she said the same thing in the Philippines. You mentioned Egypt. We give $2 billion a year to Egypt. Egypt paid no consequence for their human rights abuses. Same in the Gulf, and now our president is going to Saudi Arabia on bended knee for more oil, and he will not take any price to pay for the crown prince. So my question is, one of the things that I hear in Southeast Asia is that the United States has very selective outrage on human rights and authoritarianism. When it suits their interests, Wendy Sherman will come and praise you. When you are in a relevant country, you get a lecture. And so I see everything you're saying, but I don't see a consistency, and a lot of people in the Global South also don't see a consistency. So I just would like to hear, to see if you could address some of those inconsistencies, because that's what's really slowing down American policy with attraction, and why in the Xinjiang letter last week, again, not a single Muslim majority country. And it's not just because of investment either signed on those letters.
So, thanks for that. No, as they say, consistency is the hobgoblin of small minds. So, so you're absolutely right to point out the sort of the incoherence. A few things here, just by way of trying to organize some scattered thoughts. So first of all, right, Efraim, to your point, China is certainly not responsible for authoritarianism in the Middle East. Chinese tech could in the future be responsible for a deepening authoritarian, or deepening the longevity of authoritarian regimes, right? And that was sort of the angle that I was going for. The consistency issue is key, and these are not the only governments that are confused by the U.S. vacillation from adopting a more realist mindset to moralizing and doing things that, light the U.S.-Saudi relationship on fire, for lack of a more subtle way to put it. My sense is there's a middle road to be sown, and I think David started to talk about it, a little bit less moralizing, a little bit more consistency. I'm a pop culture kind of guy, so what I always think about is Star Trek. I don't know if all of you watch Star Trek here, but Star Trek has a federation which has a prime directive. The prime directive is that the federation does not interfere in societies until those societies are mature enough to join the federation themselves. And every single episode, that principle is violated, because the federation knows better, and it goes in and it makes a mess out of whatever planet that they happen to visit. That's actually, I think, a very good euphemism for U.S. policy, where there's more moralizing and it's inconsistent, and you get this very strange blowback effect that frankly advantages players like China that never stake out that position, so they're never undermined by a lack of consistency in its application. So my sense is that a little bit more prime directive is very useful for U.S. policy, whether it's Republican or Democrat, because you can build that center line that creates consistency across administrations that allows for engagement where local publics in Vietnam or in Saudi Arabia don't ask these kind of questions.
Yeah, I don't have terribly much to add on that, especially after the Star Trek analogy, which is fantastic. I think, this is a question that's not a new one, right? I mean, it's one that we faced in the Cold War, it's one that we'll continue to face, and it's one that's at the heart of, the issue around how democracies like the United States and Israel and others that have interests, how do you reconcile those? And I think with China becoming clearly the strategic rival and competitor for the coming decades for the United States, it's only going to be natural that we want to have good relationships with countries that are also, particularly in Asia, like Vietnam, which has, as you know, a many more years of experience with China as an aggressor than almost anyone. I think that's going to be something that is going to be natural. There's going to be a partnership there in dealing with some of these questions around China's aggression in the region. I personally think that does not mean that with a country like Vietnam, and I've been in the room with with State Department and others where there's been these meetings around human rights with Vietnam. It happens, right? We're talking to them about it wasn't recently, but I assume that's continuing to happen. I think on a public level, there needs to still be some messaging in there about how Vietnam itself and other countries that are, can be put in that same bucket need to continue to work, as do we, right? I think all these conversations ought to be about what is the ideal gold standard, which we can reach in terms of our systems and the rights of the people that we seek to govern. I think that needs to be included in all the commentaries that come out from the U.S. government about how our relationships are moving ahead with countries like Vietnam or Laos or others. I do think there's a distinction that can be made between a country like China, not just because I think some of what's happening inside China is worse than what's happening in other autocratic regimes, especially in Xinjiang, but also other things. But I think you can also point to the effect, as I kind of was touching on a little bit in my comments, that China's engagement is having in denigrating rights and democratic institutions around the world, right? And reaching out to open societies and trying to stifle free speech there. And so I think that if we need to make a distinction about why we're taking a slightly different tack on China, not just because it is the strategic rival for the next many decades, but because I think that for many years there was an assumption, well, what happens in China stays in China, right? Oh, that's terrible for the Chinese people, what's happening there, but we need to be very realist about this. We need to engage with China as a kind of country player. But what China's doing now globally is having an effect in reaching in and affecting the institutions and the people of countries around the world in a way that the actions of a Singapore or a Vietnam or a Laos certainly are not. And I think that that's a distinction that potentially can be made. But I mean, it's a very good question. It's the conundrum, and I think especially in Asia, when we talk about our engagement with not just Vietnam, but Thailand, but with Berman, with all these countries that are really central to this question of, is China going to become the preeminent dominant player in Asia, and how do we balance pushing back on some of that and protecting U.S. and allied interests while at the same time staying true to our values? It's going to be the question for many years.
Please introduce yourself.
Thank you very much. My name is Keough. I teach Israeli foreign policy in Delhi, and I really enjoyed the conversation. I have a question to Mr. Berman. What about the Abraham Accords and the American engagement with the Middle East Quad? I mean, there's I2 and U2, and India is part of it. As an Indian, I see it a greater, let's say, effort by America to do something in the Middle East and not leave an empty ground for China to enter. Just a comment to what Dr. Shullman said and what you said. I think euphemisms don't work for the people who have been wronged in the Global South. And I think Yunnan's point about Global South having an alternative is, I think, a very important development. What happened to Bangladesh and the genocide that America completely denied is something, a very recent history. I think that has to be recognized. And I think I agree with your point that consistency might not be human. Okay, the other question to Yunnan then, what do you think happened in Sri Lanka lately? Is there a crisis that BRI legacy can be connected there?
And maybe Laos too.
Okay. So I would, on the Sri Lanka case, I would direct you to read works by, there are many other scholars who have really dug into this. My PhD supervisor, Deborah Brautigam, is one who's published extensively on this question of what happened to the Hanban-Tota port, and you know, what exactly has been the involvement of Chinese lending and Chinese companies in Sri Lanka's debt crisis. I mean, it's very complicated, I guess, is the simple and unsatisfying answer. But you know, the optics for China didn't look good, right? You had a Chinese company that ended up taking over the port. The company, the country has borrowed extensively from Chinese sources, but Sri Lanka's debt issues don't come from China. And I think this is also the problem for many other global south countries now, such as Zambia, where, you know, China and Chinese official loans have risen alongside a growing diversification of creditors from the private sector, from private banks in Europe, and also from the bond market, from bond holders. So at the same time that many countries are borrowing increasingly from China as opposed to from the World Bank, they have also been raising Eurobonds, increasingly using private capital markets. And all of those contribute to debt distress. So in the Sri Lanka case, it was actually an issue with repayment of bondholders. And in order to be able to make those repayments, the port was sold as a concession to a Chinese contractor. I believe it was the Sri Lankan government that actually asked them to take over the port. But the optics look bad for China. And I think because of the Sri Lankan case, it's actually made any kind of debt restructuring just a lot more sensitive for Chinese actors elsewhere. It eliminates any kind of debt equity swap as an instrument for debt restructuring because of how it looks, because it looks like Chinese firms or that China is taking over those assets. And so I can't really comment on what's currently happening in Sri Lanka because I don't have any expert knowledge on this. But you know, Chinese loans have certainly been problematic. Are they the only bad actor? No.
I'm going to have a conversation with you about the Abraham Accords later. I think it's a little bit out of the scope, other than to say that this may be one of those trends that reignites American engagement if it's nurtured properly. It's not a sort of a foregone conclusion that it will, but it's one to watch because it'll reverse some of that trend line that I was talking about.
I'm Shullman from the Policy.
Sir, can you
Take the mic.
so that way it'll be on the recording?
Okay, no problem. I'm Shullman from the Jewish People Policy Institute in Jerusalem. I will speak this afternoon about the China-Israel relationship, but I was very uncomfortable with two things I heard this morning. I want to get this over with so that I'm not angry this afternoon. The first is the American propaganda story that China is by far the largest investor in Israel's high-tech, which is complete nonsense. With billions of dollars flowing from America into our high-tech, how can you say such nonsense? Thank God, thank you to America, billions of dollars. The figures I have, and I will check them now if you want, I will check them over to give you the exact figures. China's investments have plateaued a few years ago, they're going down now. The Chinese are not willing to submit themselves to these checks, etc. So there are fewer and fewer Chinese investments. The last thing I heard from our foreign ministry is that Japan's investments in Israel high-tech is now equal to that of China. So don't exaggerate, you know. Second issue that made me angry is the repeated mention of genocide. The few days.
Take it easy, don't be too angry.
No, I know what genocide is. I'm a victim of a genocide. I get the pension from Germany, I get the pension from Israel. So don't tell me this is genocide that's happening. I'm convinced that what's happening in Xinjiang is not very nice. All authoritarian governments treat cruelly with minorities that challenge their integrity. China is not worse. It's not much better. Maybe it's a little bit worse, but that's not genocide. The last a few days ago, was a week ago, that the UN again censored China for its treatment of the Uyghurs. You remember this? The word genocide is missing. Israel for the second time voted for.
They leave it for Israel, right? The UN leaves this word for Israel.
No, yeah, okay. I'm convinced that Israel has told the United States if that declaration again uses the word genocide, Israel will vote against. And that's why the US has taken it out. We don't have that word anymore. I don't want to go on about genocide, but
You have a question, Shalom?
no. Questions is after. Okay.
May I have a quick follow-up? Do you want to respond?
Yeah.
Okay.
So a couple of things, because I think this is great. I'm delighted to hear that China is not the foremost nation-state investor in Israel, and that these patterns are beginning to shift. I worry about the level, comparing sort of apples and saying that the Japanese are equal as a way of ignoring or glossing over the problematic aspects of the level of Chinese investment that you have, right? Because even if China was the 54th nation-state investor in Israel, there would still be problematic aspects that all this whole panel has talked about that are associated with Chinese behavior. So I think that's a little bit of a straw man argument. On the genocide issue, excuse me, right? I'm a lawyer. I'm a recovering lawyer. It's a lifelong process. But under the 1948 Genocide Convention, the definition of genocide is the willful intent to eliminate, in whole or in part, a specific ethnic, confessional, or I forget what the other word is, group, based upon a number of enumerated things. Religion is one of them, right? And so under the legal definition, the international legal definition that the US government adheres to and has adhered to under multiple administrations, this does meet that standard. It may not meet your standard, which I understand and I'm sympathetic to. However, in legal terms, I'm not sure the issue is quite as murky as you made out.
May I ask a quick follow-up question for Yunnan? Because I'm very curious about, I've been talking to some folks in the Middle East who work on the debt issue. And what they have told me, and I very much want your feedback on this, is that while we've seen the China Development Bank and other banks have been going down significantly, they've seen a lot of commercial lending. And this commercial lending is beyond their sight because it's going to specific companies or specific firms, and they can't even monitor it. And so the way they basically said is, we don't know what we don't know. What we don't know is scaring us right now because we know what we know, and that's scary enough. And so I wonder if you could talk about this move towards concessional lending, which is not concessional, commercial lending, which is not at concessional rates, and how that impacts the future of the debt situation that you were talking about in the Middle East and North Africa. And the rest of Africa.
Sure, just to... What I'll say is probably very scattered, but I'll try and respond to it, and maybe we can have a discussion afterwards. It's certainly... There's a huge question, right, and controversy over this phenomenon of hidden debts, and I think in part because of the backlash or the more negative experiences that Chinese lenders have experienced over the last decade with sovereign lending directly to sovereign governments. This has prompted an evolution in the type of finance that we're going to see in terms of investment. So the 2000s, 2010s was really defined by this growth of policy bank lending. Some of it was concessional from China Exim Bank, a lot of it was on commercial terms. Official lending, I mean, depending on whether or not you see China Development Bank as a commercial bank or a policy bank. But a lot of these have you know, as we've discussed, triggered a lot of problems when sovereign governments can't repay the loans. So a lot of these are government to government, right, official loans. In response, I think there is a growing trend of, rather than export buyers credits, we're using export sellers credits. There's also simultaneously been a growing rise from Chinese commercial banks overseas. I really don't know enough about that in the Middle East, and so definitely want to discuss it with you. But my impression is that also when commercial banks go overseas for investment, they also need insurance underwriting, especially in high-risk territories. And that usually requires some kind of state backing from Sinoshore. And this has become also increasingly problematic. The ability or willingness of Sinoshore to underwrite a lot of these political risks has also been in decline in recent years. So I don't know is the answer on the commercial side, but definitely there is going to be a shift from official to commercial in the years to come.